it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Wynne Godley. Wynne, when and where were you born?
I was born in Paddington. We had, that was before we became, or before we recovered our Irish heritage. And my parents lived in Sussex at that time.
When was this?
I was born in 1926.
Hmm.
And then what happened was that, well, I really should go back a bit.
Yes, well, I was going to ask you about your grandparents.
Yes, and my great-grandparents.
And great-grandparents.
Because it's all rather a mystery to me, because my great-great-grandfather married an heiress, which was a great deal of land in a very poor part of Ireland. And he must have been a man of great imagination, because he made a very, very wonderful domain. I mean, he had 4,000 or 5,000 acres of land, poor land, which was let out. But he made a very beautiful, wondrously beautiful place, which planted up beech and oak woods, overlooking lakes, and a modest mansion house which looked over the lakes.
This was at Kilbracken.
Killigar is the name of the house.
Yeah.
It's next to the townland of Kilbracken.
This is Killigar.
Killigar.
In what date? It looks a bit...
1900.
Ah, it's already looking a little bit...
1892.
Hmm.
And then he had a lot of children, of whom the most distinguished was, he was called John Robert Godley, and he ailed, but he went nevertheless in 1848, he founded the province of Christchurch in New Zealand, and he went there, sailed there in 1948-9, and founded the province, and then came back and was then permanent secretary of the War Office. And Gladstone admired him very much, called him, I think I got my Greek correct, Anax Andron, a king among men. And would certainly have been in the cabinet if he'd lived. But he was ill all that time. All that time he was ill. And my grandfather, in his reminiscences, describes that how at the age of 12 he went into his room and to his astonishment his father told him he was going to die, and he died that day, and he had no idea that this was going to happen. And then, after very distinguished, but not at the top level, as it were. So then my grandfather, Arthur Godley, became very close to Gladstone, and was his second private secretary in 1872, and actually lived in 10 Downing Street. And then he was again his principal private secretary in 1884. And immediately after that he became permanent secretary of India, which he was, I think, for 26 years. A man of extraordinary ability and knowledge and scholarship. And
did he live in India much of that time?
He didn't even go to India all his life. Extraordinary.
Isn't it?
He didn't think it necessary, and went to considerable lengths as far as I can make out not to go. But he was considered to be very successful, and he kept up all his learning, and his classical scholarship, and eventually became interested. He gave up all his literary interests in favour of Dante. I've got all his books on Dante there. So anyway, he lived to be quite an age, and you see I've got a picture here of him with me.
Is that's the two of you, is it?
Both of us.
I'll just see if I can zoom in on it. There it is, just above your head. You've got a little boat with you, is that right?
I've got the little boat with me, but I've also got it up there, the ferry boat, on the top of my...
Lovely. The yacht, which appears in the portrait with the Wynne's grandfather.
Anyway, my grandfather was the... See, he's there, I think he's about 85, about 1 year before he died, with me about 5. And he's been the inspiration of my life, the positive inspiration. He had such authority, and I don't like to use the word good with children, but he had a gift with children whom he could entertain for an endless length of time. And in treats, he took me, well, he was a very rich man. But for instance, he would get his chauffeur, we'd go to the nearest station, we'd take a train, the chauffeur would be waiting at the other end to pick us up. So you can see how I would have loved him. And I did love him, and I still love him. And I think about him more and more and more.
What about your grandmother?
My grandmother died in 1920, and very little has been handed down about her. She was married, her maiden name was James. And in fact, the only story I know about her is that she asked some people to dinner and they didn't turn up. And when she came back into the dining room where everybody was sitting and eating, she said, "How horrid you all look eating my hot ham." That's the only thing that I've ever heard that she said.
How strange. Your grandfather became Lord...
That's right, Lord Kilbracken, and he was honoured in his retirement in about 1911 or 12. Not for buying his peerage, but for sterling work at the India Office and in other civil service jobs that he had. Now, what is interesting to me, and I never quite fathomed it, was that he had 2 first cousins. I mean, he had many first cousins, but 2 of them became very distinguished. One was somebody called Alfred Dennis, A.G. Godley, who was the public orator at Oxford, a distinguished classical scholar, known mainly now for his comic verse. He wrote a very famous poem called "What is it that roareth thus? Can it be a motor bus? Yes, the smell and hideous hum, indicat motorem bum." And so he goes through all the cases, ending up with "Domine defende nos, contra hos motoris bos." A lot of them, they're very funny poems. And I've got his relations. He introduced Richard Strauss for a doctor, with references to Electra and Salome. And another cousin who was a general, who commanded the Anzacs. Now, he wasn't popular as a general. Both at Gallipoli and in Passchendaele. And nearly 4,000 people were killed in a single day in Passchendaele under his command. But he was a very charming man, very handsome man. But what is strange to me is that this sort of clutch of, not as it were spectacular, but nevertheless very distinguished men, came out of this sort of boggy, rushy place in the in the poorest part of Ireland.
Mm.
Um,
But they presumably came out and then went to expensive English boarding schools.
yes, they all did. I think they all did. My grandfather, there was some mix-up to do. I don't know what the details are. I've never been able to find out. But my grandfather, sold all the land, all the agricultural land
In Ireland.
in Ireland in the 90s.
Mm.
I think there was a scheme to buy out the present from the landowners, and they just preserved what's called the domain and kept it up. But my grandfather didn't like the place for some reason I've never been able to discover, and never went there after his early childhood. So then, well, I might just continue that. This very, very wonderfully beautiful place was let to a cousin of my grandfather's until 1936. Uncle Archie, we used to call him, he died in about 1910. But he had a daughter who lived there. And then, I'm sorry to say, there was a very abrupt descent into hell, because my father was a very severe alcoholic. And he fell in love with somebody who wasn't my mother. So my parents were separated about the time I was born. I never really saw them together. But they had this nice house in Sussex, which was adjoined the property of my grandfather. So I saw a great deal of him through my very early childhood. But through the first 6 or 7 years of my life, there was great enmity between my parents. And of course I couldn't detect drunkenness as a young child. I couldn't see what was happening. But nevertheless, there's something so many people have suffered from, having drunken parents, that I almost forbear to mention it. But the trauma...
You say parents.
Oh yes, no, my mother wasn't a drunkard.
Yeah.
No, my mother was not. She was fey. I mean, she wrote children's poems and had, but no, she was not. But she was very deeply affected by the split, and they did hate one another. They all kept correspondence in those days. There were pages and pages of solicitors' letters and accusing letters. Oh, that's just terrible. Through a period of at least 10 years.
What was your father's occupation?
He was a lawyer, and his principal occupation. He was a bit of a coward, I now think. I mean, he didn't really like practicing at the bar, but he was a learned man. I mean, he was. Well, that's what he was. He was thoroughly well informed, and had remembered his Latin and Greek right through to the end of his life, and a man of great personal charm. But then he had a sort of secret love affair. It started in about 1930, and my home was not really populated, although I had 2 siblings who were older than me.
Brothers or?
I had one brother and one sister, and I also had a half-sister who was what should I call her? She was but the home was not populated. There weren't children in it, and there weren't friends.
Mm.
So I spent a lot of time, lonely time, not being properly educated. I mean, 4, 5, 6. And I was ill. I had a bad year. And when I was 7, my father had me made us all wards of court, and I went to see a judge in Chambers, and he said I was fit to go to school. So when I was just 7 years old, and never having dressed myself, literally, I had not ever dressed myself. I didn't know how to dress.
Who had dressed you?
I had a governess.
Oh, right.
Who did everything for me. And I went through the Chamber of Horrors at a British prep school.
Which one was that?
Well, it was one called Ashdown House, which was near, not far away,
In Sussex?
in Sussex.
Yeah, the Ashdown Forest.
Ashdown, on the Ashdown Forest. I went to a kind of gaudy lunch there recently, and it had multiplied by 5. It had a lot of very pretty matrons. I couldn't help noticing.
Which you didn't have in your day, as you remember.
Had very fierce people. There was a terrifying man called Mr. Bather.
Bather?
Bather. B-A-T. You know, I talked about these things, but he was, you know, his memories. We were going on to the football, to play football, and he was wearing, you know, remember those shorts that people, professionals, baggy, very baggy white shorts, and great big boots. And he shouted out, "Hurry up!" And then one of the children said, not having heard him obviously, "There's no hurry." And so, I've forgotten what his name was, I can usually remember. He said, "Well, bend over." You know, and he ran at him with his shorts snapping, and so gave him a colossal kick with his boots. And see, you know, you could tell it more or less as a funny story, but it's very frightening for a young child to see such a thing. And then books are full of such incidents. Anyway, yes.
How long were you at the school?
Well, I was ill, and eventually I had an operation. I was at school for about 1.5 years. And then I went to a real snob school called Sandroyd, which was well known for, there were a lot of sort of famous business names, which of course I didn't realise at the time. Berkeley and Sneyd and Pyman. And
Where was the school?
that was in Surrey, Cobham. And there were 3 little Karageorgievich princes who were nice. And they were an attractive tribe. But there were real, although it was a rather formidable place with an awful lot of beating.
Were you beaten?
Yes, and it hurt. School of headmaster.
But the teaching was reasonable.
Well, the teaching was excellent. I mean, it was in a very important way I do owe my education, because although he was a horrible, he had saving graces, headmaster, because he had a sense of humour. There was a famous occasion on which a boy fainted, and he tried to pick him up by pulling at the leg of another master. Instead of pulling at the boy's foot, he pulled at the leg of another master who was trying to pick him up. And the whole situation seemed to be so absurd. He became in chapel, this one. He began to laugh I couldn't, uncontrollably. But of the masters who was there was a man called John Graves, who taught Latin, and who was the brother of Robert Graves. And there was a very ambitious maths master.
And Graves was good, was he, as a Latin master?
Well, I didn't too much. I got to like him later on. He had me thrashed. Because, and that was quite revealing stuff. He said, "Godley, why are you yawning?" And I gave him, I said, "Because I was feeling bored, sir." But we're going to see the headmaster before lunch. Yeah. And there was another good Latin master. They were really well-educated people.
And the maths master, you said, was?
Yeah, very, very good. In his ambition for the pupils. And he forced me to make an effort. So there's a certain kind of mathematical or arithmetical manipulation became easy to me and saw me through.
Were you beginning to enjoy intellectual things by this time, or?
Only thing which I really enjoyed was the English. So I learnt a lot of poetry by heart. And again, it was rather symptomatic. Because my father said to me, "You can have, I give you £5. That equals £100. If you learn the whole of the Ancient Mariner by Christmas."
Did you?
I got up to 130, verse 135, and then headmaster heard of this. He said, "This has got to stop." Never gave any explanation, but it wasn't
Coordinated.
wasn't sort of conventional, and I still know it. I mean, jolly nearly.
Were you good at other things by this time?
I
Games
won
or
the golf championship.
at that school?
Yes,
Good heavens!
they had a golf course, and I also did a hole-in-one, and I won the chess championship. But I never was any good at the regular games. I wanted to be, but I had no gift.
So then you went on at the age of what, 12, 13?
I went at 13. I went to Rugby, which I still think was a good school. I was beginning to get very keen on music, and I had two people in my life from about that time, from about 1939, 40, who were enormously influential in my life. One was the music master at Rugby, who was called Kenneth Stubbs. He was a bachelor, and he was a piano teacher of genius. And I know he was a friend of Donald Tovey. Is that a name you know?
Yes, I've heard the name.
He's a very, very distinguished musicologist. And I was just thinking, during the time I was at Rugby, he trained up, I think there were 6 during the 3 years I was there, 6 boys who played movements, difficult movements from difficult concertos. Now Beethoven 4, Rachmaninoff 2, Grieg, César Franck, Brahms 2, all played to a high standard with a good orchestra. Anyway, he was a man of very great personal charm, who welcomed boys into his house. So I avoided the rigours of Rugby life. Not that they were severe, but I spent a great deal of time in his house.
You were learning the clarinet?
Learning oboe.
Oboe.
The teaching wasn't very good, but again I played a terrible lot of music, even at Rugby. Got through a lot of music. And the second musical influence was William Glock. Heard of William Glock?
Sounds familiar.
Yes. Well, he was an extraordinary man. His only real integrity was with regard to music. He had flypaper memory like Frank Kermode. If you said a list of numbers, you know, £7, 12 and sixpence, £18, it just added up in his mind. He was a very, very fine pianist. He was a pupil of Schnabel. And well, as I now see it, he was a bit of a rogue, because he was a sponger in the first part of his life. And
is he now dead?
yes, he is dead.
I don't want any libel suits.
No, well, I've got to be a bit careful because I loved him. You know, these somewhat psychopathological people who come into families, they're always, and disrupt them, are very, very deeply loved. He came on the scene as, well, as I now know, as my mother's lover. But he used to stay with us in London, and I adored him. And then I learnt a terrible lot of music from hearing him play.
What age was this?
Starting at about 12. So my time at Rugby was, in a sense, I feel that I was never really there, because I was all the time playing my oboe, and later on the piano a little bit. I started much too late. Started everything too late, musically. But I acquired a certain sort of schoolboy. All the teaching of music was very much, apart from this man himself, was very much inferior to what it is now. So I didn't learn my scales and arpeggios properly.
Were there any academic subjects which you were
No.
getting interested in?
Not really. I had a good classics master, and I learned a lot of English from him. He was a great reader. But my knowledge of classics began to slip and slip. And I just got into, I could do a prose good enough to get into Oxford, but I wasn't at all interested in it. I was only really interested in music. The time that I left Rugby, my only serious interest was music, and playing, above all playing music.
Is that what you went to read at Oxford?
No, I did modern greats at Oxford. And then I had an absolutely marvellous time. I started all over again.
We've missed the war. The war had no real influence.
Oh yes, that's advisedly, because although my brother was in the Navy as a fleet air arm, I was a bit anxious about him. He flew swordfish on convoys to America and Russia. But somehow we got through the war. You see, the war began, I was born on the 2nd of September, which was the day they marched into Poland. And so it began absolutely just at the beginning of my time, just before I went to Rugby. And I didn't encounter the war as a serious phenomenon at all. Not at all. I didn't read the newspapers. I mean, it's wrong and weak, narrow-minded. But I didn't. And nobody did. Nobody at school did. And I was allowed to go with my father to Ireland during the holidays, where there were mountains of butter and eggs and meat, and no blackout. So
it didn't affect you
I
too much.
bypassed the war, I'm ashamed to say. I didn't follow it properly.
And you
and
went
I'm
to
ashamed of that.
you went to Oxford more or less just after the war then?
No,
You went to Oxford more or less just after the war then?
no, it was still just about in progress. I went at the end of 1943.
Did you? Hmm.
It was only a very short time at Rugby, yes. 43, and I was there at Oxford for 3.5 years, luckily.
And why was Oxford so wonderful?
Well, I had very lovely rooms in New College. I had my mother's Steinway grant. It was luxury beyond anything you could imagine. And I had the most wonderful teachers. And wonderful senior common room, who were very indulgent to me. I was spoiled. I mean, to begin with, I was taught by a man you very likely wouldn't have heard of, called Philip Andrews, P.W.S. Andrews, who taught me, he was, again, very ambitious for his pupils, and had what I can now see to be heterodox ideas which became deeply embedded in my mind at that time. I mean, he taught me the regular things, but he had this very lively interest in particularly the manufacturing industry and how it worked, which he taught me, and which were tremendously influential, subconsciously to me, throughout the whole of my life. Well, I mean, with regard to economics. And I didn't realise that at all. And then as time went on, of course there was a very lively musical life going on with Dr. Armstrong, Thomas Armstrong, who was the organist at Christchurch. And he was in charge of the orchestra there, Oxford Orchestral Society. And the amount of music we got through, the B minor Mass, the St. Matthew Passion, Brahms Third. I mean, just huge repertoires in Schubert Symphony, great symphony, Schubert Unfinished. I mean, no end to the wonderful things we played at a reasonable standard.
This is in the Oxford Orchestral.
Oh, it was called the Oxford Orchestral Society, but I had a great friend who was also a known physicist called Christopher Lonkett Higgins.
Oh, very famous, yes. Yeah.
He's a very brilliant musician. I don't know if you do that.
I think I did, yes.
And he ran his own orchestra, and I used to play in that. And then, of course, the biggest event, if you like, of my life in many different ways was Isaiah Berlin, who taught me for a year and a half before I took schools. I specialised in Kant and logic, not economics.
You could have done economics, but you didn't. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I wasn't really truly interested in economics, wasn't interested in industry. I was quite interested in...
So it sounds as if Modern Greats was really a sort of precursor to PPE. Is that
It
right?
was PPE. It was also called PPE.
Was it? Oh,
yes.
right.
Yes.
Okay.
But my passion was philosophy through Isaiah.
Tell me something about him, your memories of him.
Well,
he talked very fast, I remember.
He talked very fast. See, almost my first impression of him was that he was slightly silly. Because he had none of that grandness that came to him in later life. None of it at all. I thought of him as being, a funny man, above which I mean a wit, a man in whose company you laughed. And there was, however, one I mean, I've written about this actually in a piece I wrote about part of my life. But I think it's quite a good story, both about me and about him. That he, see, I've always found it difficult to confront people. And so my natural desire when he was teaching me was to somehow work out what it was that he was thinking and then produce what he wanted. So I'd read my essay on logic, whatever it was, and he'd comment on it. And then I would try to work out from his comments what his view about the subject was. Then I'd reproduce this the next day. And then he'd use his chopper on my revised piece. And then I tried to do the same thing again. Well, now, this must be what he really thinks. Getting myself into a worse and worse model. And model. Anyway, then, after this had gone on for about 4 times, and I was reading out, there's a 4th version of this, he suddenly burst out laughing. I mean, really laughing, and said, how gloriously artificial was how it. I was rather mortified. But of course he was absolutely right, and, you know, because by this questionnaire method and tearing me into pieces, he forced me to make a mental effort that I'd never in my life made before. And really almost to that moment, I owe all the real mental training that I ever had.
Did he stop this procedure of backwards and forwards after that or not?
Well, he gradually took me more seriously. I mean, the whole thing became more serious. But I had a relationship with him apart from teaching him. And we used to go to the cinema together in London.
Was this while you were an undergraduate?
No, that actually was after. I didn't have an intimate relationship with him until I left. But there were a lot of other very amusing people there. I mean, notably Lord David Cecil, who was an extraordinarily entertaining man. And he used to invite me to dinner at High Table, which we aren't allowed to do in Cambridge. And
was he at New College?
Yes. And there were other people. So it was like being in heaven, really.
There was much less of a gap between the dons and the undergraduates.
Much less. There was intimacy. And Agnes Headland-Morley, she taught me modern history and was a good friend.
Did you go to Isaiah's lectures?
Yes.
They were phenomenal, weren't they?
Well, the ones I went to were slow.
Were they?
Yes. I mean, you could write them down.
I went towards the end and you just couldn't write anything. It was just...
No, I think when he was doing philosophy, he spelled it all out.
Was he interested in liberty at that time?
He didn't talk to me about it.
Yes.
We talked about philosophy, we gossiped.
Did he talk about his background, his East European background?
Well, just very occasionally. But he didn't feature it. It was very light-hearted. He talked... I mean, I was going to say, I do say, he talked a lot of nonsense. I mean, he thought certain words were funny. Like wombat. He thought that was a funny word. No. We said silly things to one another, you know. And his persona did change when he became so immensely influential. Because I then much later on I had quite a different life with him at Covent Garden.
So how did you get on in the final examination?
I got a first.
You did?
Yeah, I did. I can't think how, but I did.
And were there any friends of your own generation who you remained in touch with or were influential at that time?
No.
You mentioned Longanet Higgins.
Longanet Higgins.
Yeah.
He just died the other day. I kept up with him while I was in Paris. I went to Paris for 3 years immediately after Oxford. I kept up with him for a time, but for various reasons we didn't keep up my very intimate relationship. The other very close friend that I had was somebody you very likely wouldn't have heard of, called Hugh Leach. He was a medieval historian and had a tremendous success at Bletchley, at decoding things. He was a man of extraordinary knowledge for his age, or for any age.
So he'd come back from Bletchley?
Yes. And he got a first, needless to say.
Why did you go to Paris after?
Well, this is a big story. You see, I got my first when I was only 20 then. Well, I'd been 3.5 years.
So you'd gone up at 16? Or
just not. Just 17. I thought I had no ambition. And I thought I would go and study music. I had a stupid, completely misconceived idea that I would be able to learn to play the oboe well enough to earn my living by it, and that I would still have time to write novels or be a literary man, have two careers. And to some extent, I spent 3 years in Paris. I was taught by the professor at the Conservatoire, whom I had every reason to suppose was a very good teacher, but whom I now think was a very bad teacher. But that was my principal activity then, almost all that I did by way of work, all that I did by way of work, was learnt to play the oboe. I lived for the first year, I suppose I had a rather unique experience. I lived in a family, the father was a director of the French railways. So it was a sort of middle class, rather well to do. They had 10 children, all of them, except 2, grown up. A huge flat in the 6th arrondissement. And I had a lot of friends in the British Embassy too. Met a lot of people. And then it had a sort of high social aspect to it. Nancy Mitford.
Oh yes.
And
you met her?
I knew her quite well.
And what was she like?
I never really liked her.
You didn't like her?
Not really.
No. Was she as snobby as she?
Oh, absolutely. Worse.
Did you meet the whole clan of Mitfords?
No, I didn't know the other Mitfords. She was married to a man called Peter Rodd, who is known of course, as Prod, who was a dull man. Definitely a leaden man. She lived a smart life in the Rue Monsieur. And through her I did meet the Duff Coopers. And then Diana Cooper became a close friend. I mean, I hate to say took me up, but I spent a lot of time alone with her. We went
She
out.
was meant to be very beautiful, wasn't
She was very beautiful. She kept her beauty.
she? Mm.
But it was her wit
Mm.
that she was very, very funny
Mm.
and good company. And she'd known my father and had amusing stories to tell about him. What was the name of that? They had a...
Did you say she's now my father?
She... No,
That's
no.
my deafness, probably.
I just said she told me about her life and high flirtation with my father.
Ah, right.
About
Yep.
30 years previously.
Yep.
When they used to go up some tower in one of the castles they lived in and
Mm.
have kissing sessions. What she called great big gluers. Proper kisses.
Mm.
So I don't feel I distinguished myself in those rather elevated levels, but I did go there and I did watch. I experienced it all.
Mm.
And Duff Cooper,
Mm.
he was a formidable man.
Mm.
He had an extraordinary knowledge of poetry by heart and rather peppery.
Mm.
He was a man who lost his bait. He lost his bait rather easily. They lived somewhat separately.
Was he an ambassador? Also?
Yes,
That's right.
he was ambassador to France,
That's right.
but not when I...
And he wrote about Talleyrand, what was it?
He did.
Yeah. Mm.
And he wrote about King David, that's right.
Mm.
Well, he was
So you had a good time in Paris, you enjoyed it?
fantastic.
Mm. It was after the war, but I suppose it's beginning to recover a bit.
Well, you see, it was so cheap and so run down.
Mm.
And I got a scholarship. Alexander Korda gave me a scholarship to live and enough money to live there for 2 years.
Mm.
And then I changed my lodgings. The bad part of that was that I didn't get any, well, I was studying music. I didn't get any music. I didn't, I'd formed the opinion, which I've never quite lost, that the French don't really like it.
Music?
Yeah. And so above all, not French musicians.
They don't like French musicians?
They don't, no, French musicians don't like music.
Oh, right.
'Cause we used to play such rubbish. I once went into the professor's room, happened to be carrying a score of a Beethoven quartet, and he said, "Qu'est-ce que vous faites avec cette petite musique-là?" He didn't like me liking Beethoven. He was the first oboe in the Paris Opera, of course.
You used to go to music, presumably, at the opera and so
I
on?
didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Mm.
I learnt music. But what I did do, though, my musical friends were all Americans.
Mm.
Because I'd been brought up to have a considerable degree of contempt for all Americans.
Mm.
And to my astonishment, there was a clutch of American music students who were absolutely brilliant. Composers, pianists, performers, and in fact the first public concert, there was a wonderful girl there, Sarah Cunningham, she'd written a piece for violin and oboe and piano. And I played it with her in I think it was in the Salle Pleyel, anyway, one of the big concert venues in Paris. I've never been so frightened in my life. But it went quite well. But all my playing experience was with these American experiences. I hardly played in an orchestra single. If ever I did play in an orchestra, it was in what the conservatoire called classe de chef d'orchestre. In other words, it was a conducting class. So we've got a piece which is notoriously difficult to conduct, like the beginning of the last movement of the Third Symphony, which is very difficult to do. You have to sit there and play this bloody piece. Well, 15 aspiring conducting students came. So that was almost all the playing I got in an orchestra. And then, anyway...
what happened at the end of Paris? You went...
Well, I had the most extraordinary luck. I can't imagine how it happened. I mean, does this interest you?
It does. Period I wasn't very old in, and it's fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating, yes. Go on. What happened to you?
Well, I did something which is scarcely credible. I had to buy reeds for my oboe, and I went to see the man who was known to be the expert. I mean, all proper oboe players make their own reeds, but I couldn't do it. Anyway, I went to buy this, and he said to me that he'd been asked to play second oboe in an orchestra that was well known at the time, called the New London Orchestra, but he couldn't do it. And would I like to go in his place? Well, I had no orchestral experience. And what was his name? I remember all these things. Alex Sherman, he was called, the conductor. Quite a well-known orchestra. I knew about it, had about him. And I rang up his brother, who was the fixer, and said, I've been asked to play this, but I won't do it unless Alex Sherman hears me and gives me an audition. And he said, okay, and I went to his house, and he asked the conductor, and I had the parts, I played the parts, and he liked me, and he engaged me, and I played it. Now, the piece we played was actually, which was the great C minor concerto of Mozart. It has incredibly difficult wind parts, and the slow movement in particular. And I learnt them. I mean, I could technically play them, but terribly difficult to put it together. And I went along to the rehearsal as though I was going to my execution. And I played them. I played these parts. They went all right. Played in the concert. And it went all right. I mean, I was terribly shaken by the whole experience. To my astonishment, the fixer, who was also called Sherman, rang me up and fixed me up for 4 more concerts. And as a result of this absolutely insane burst of honesty, I mean, quixotic to a degree that you can, instead of gobbling it up, to demand that I should be auditioned, I then became the official second oboe of that orchestra, and I found myself playing all over London and difficult parts. The second concert had the entry of the Queen of Sheba, which has quite spectacular parts for the two oboes. So that's how I got into it, and I stayed in there. And I could match, I could rise to that. I also got a job in a ballet orchestra. I've played 4 acts of Swan Lake, and of The Sleeping Beauty, and of other.
Nutcracker and so on.
Well, the big one with the willies and. Very, very amusing pieces to play. Once you think you're sick of them, but it's all full of jam. And then I got a job. Then I was principal in the BBC Welsh Orchestra and played the solo parts for a year, 1951. 5 concerts, short concerts. Remember, there's 5 live broadcasts a week. And then I went back to well, it was then called they were all the same people, Boyd Neal Orchestra. And we went on a tour of the United States and Canada. But all this time I was getting ill through nerves, performance, terrified, always. And I remember thinking, I can't continue with this. Well, you know, I played in the B minor Mass with Unesco conducting and Paul Zacher was a great, famous conductor. I just had to give it up. Not because there was no loss to the profession, but I was so terrified. Through all that very happy time of being with my of starting being in Paris and all that. There was a counterpart which was counterpoint, which was very deeply distressing because my father disintegrated mentally with drink. He kept his authority in a way, but I mean there was something, and I never could confront him with it. I could never talk to him about it. And he became deeply estranged from his second wife, whom I was extremely fond of. And then she shot herself with a shotgun. That would have been just at the beginning of my second year in Paris. And he died in 1950, just about the time I was coming back from Paris. He just went to a severe decline. But you can imagine from that little story that there were moments of very serious degradation, and very conspicuous, because he was the grandee in the Irish countryside. So it was all very visible.
He was living at
Killygold. Well, you see, he got the... Having been a lawyer, having been a counsellor, you know, he then became... He was a very skilled draftsman, and he became the what's called counsel to the Lord Chairman. Or no, it's called counsel, parliamentary counsel to the Treasury. So he used to draft bills, and he drafted what's the name of the man who got deadlock, holy deadlock.
Oh, A.P. Herbert.
A.P. Herbert. He drafted A.P. Herbert's bill.
On divorce.
And that's what and then he became, got an official, although he was a peer, he got an official job in the House of Lords, and got the sack for making an arse of himself in the peer's dining room, which he didn't like. But he didn't really believe that anybody ever noticed it. It was the first thing he noticed, who knew. So that was all...
The background to Paris, yes.
Terrible trauma. I mean, a child, I would say, at least I certainly couldn't distance myself from what was going on.